Now I would like to introduce Mr. Bill Emmott. Mr. Emmott has always been very generous to us and gave a keynote at the UCD Japan Fair back in 2019. And last year, he came back to act as a respondent for Professor Hugo Dobson at Sheffield University, his keynote speech, which is also, by the way, on our YouTube channel, if you missed it. As you all know, earlier this week, a new Prime Minister, Mr. Fumio Kishida, became the 100th Prime Minister of Japan. And there will be a general election later this month. So it's a brilliant timing to welcome you back, Bill-san, this time as a speaker. And you will give a lecture later tonight for the audience in the US and people on the Pacific Rim. So thank you. Mr. Bill Emmott is a writer, best known for his time as editor-in-chief of The Economist between 1993 and 2006, but also for his many books on Japan, which began with the best-selling The Sun Also Sets, Why Japan Will Not Be Number One. He is now chair of the Japan Society of the UK, of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and of Trinity College Dublin's Long Room Hub for Arts and Humanities. And Bill-san is also co-director of the Global Commission for Post-Pandemic Policy. He is also a member of the University of Tokyo's Global Advisory Board, and Bill-san was presenter and co-author of the documentary film about Italy, Girlfriend in a Coma, and executive producer of the great European disaster movie, both shown on the BBC and other broadcasters. He is the author of 14 books on Japan, Asia, the 20th century, and Italy, the latest of which probably you know was Japan's Far More Female Future. Increasing gender equality and reducing workplace insecurity will make Japan stronger, which was published from Oxford University Press last year. So in 2016, Emmott Sensei was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, gold raised with neck ribbon for service to UK-Japan relations. And at this point, without further ado, I will now hand over to you, Emmott Sensei. And so Bill-san will speak for roughly 40 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. And please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit questions during his talk. The virtual floor is yours, Bill-sensei. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kodate-sensei. It's wonderful to be back with UCD Center for Japanese Studies and your Japan Fair, even if online, me down in Kalaini, you at UCD and all around Dublin and of course Ireland and Japan. And I'm delighted to be part of this collaboration with Portland State University. As Kodate-sensei said, my topic today is digital disruption, political pressure and new opportunities, the future of mass media and its impact on Japan. And I give that lecture in the guise of like a recovering media practitioner, someone who's spent much of his life in the media and so feels I have some experience and knowledge of the media, particularly obviously the international media, specifically The Economist and to a lesser degree the Financial Times, but also of course as a student of Japan. I would describe myself as an addict of Japan rather than a scholar of Japan. I'm not a specialized student of Japanese mass media, but as a fellow media person and as someone who of course studies political economy of Japan, I think that the nature and direction of the Japanese mass media is an important subject. So as I am not a fluent reader of Japanese, I'm not the right person to ask questions about the specific style or changing mood of Japanese newspapers, for example, but I'm going to talk about, in fact, the environment for mass media in Japan, commercial, political, technological, and how it fits into global mass media trends. A reasonable first question to ask is, why study or discuss the mass media at all? Of course, media practitioners like me love to discuss their own business, but why should anyone else do so? Personally, as a journalist and as an editor, I never actually found the media per se particularly interesting. I always was interested in what the media was writing about, what the media was saying, rather than the specific nature of the media. But I think we would all agree that in this digital age, that sense that the media is simply a channel through which we look at the things we're really interested in has changed. Because after all, the flow of information is the lifeblood of our societies, particularly democratic ones. In autocracies, control over information is a crucial lever, crucial part of the authoritarian mindset and technique. And the changes driven by technology in the mass media have changed the way in which both authoritarian societies exercise that control over the flow of information, but most critically for us in Ireland and Japan and the United States and other democracies, it has changed the way in which our democracies themselves work. It has really done 5 basic things. It has greatly improved or enhanced, accelerated the flow of information. It has, however, transformed and often weakened the business models of media companies themselves. It has led to much more fragmentation or dispersal of power and like concentration of curation within the media. It has given rise, this technological change, to new efforts by political forces of all kinds, governments, political parties, personalities, to manipulate and pressure the media. And alongside this, and very much as a powerful influence, we've seen the rise of social media enabled by technology, which, far from dispersing power, has actually led to concentrated power in the hands of a relatively small number of digital platforms. Dispersal of provision of information, but concentrated power among the digital platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and the others. And we saw this week in Washington especially that the exercise of that power being highly controversial, perhaps one of the most important political issues of our time, with a Facebook whistleblower giving a testimony to Congress. So overall, the mass media has certainly become more interesting, more significant, because it is not only an agent of change, but a subject of change itself. So what about Japan? How does Japan fit in? Well, I think the answer to that question, as I will explain in more detail later, is that Japan's mass media, and indeed Japan's whole media scene and information scene, is moving in the same direction as the global direction, at a different speed or at different speeds, and as with everything, very much with special Japanese characteristics. For a key issue, as you know better than I do, in all studies of Japan, is whether we stress or identify differences or similarities. I think very often that decision by writers, by scholars, as to whether to stress the differences or the similarities, whether to use a comparative approach or very much a snapshot approach of how Japan has evolved, come down to whether those characteristics are principally seen by the scholar as being attributed to something static, often identified with the word culture, or whether they're attributed to something more dynamic, something that evolves according to a particular constellation of forces within Japan, but nevertheless still evolves as those forces themselves change. I will say up front that I don't tend to accept the static culture-based view. That's not just because, as in the quotation variously attributed to Hermann Goering, to Goebbels, and to a German playwright, that when I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. It is rather that I think that the attribution to culture is very often a substitute for thought, a substitute for actual scrutiny of why things are as they are, and therefore of the agents of possible change within that. So let me quickly summarize what I think are the special characteristics of the Japanese media before then going into the global scene. Just so that you have, those of you who aren't so familiar, have in mind how the Japanese media does differ from the European, or the Irish, the British, European media, and the American media in particular. Characteristic number one is that Japanese mass media has very concentrated ownership. And thanks to Japanese law, that ownership is allowed to own several different media platforms. Many countries around the world have either forbidden or restricted the cross-holding from newspapers into television or vice versa. That's not the case in Japan. So we have essentially 6 media giants in Japan, 5 newspaper groups, and 1 public broadcaster, NHK. The 5 newspaper groups, Asahi, Yomiuri, Mainichi, Nikkei, and Sankei, the principal newspaper groups, all own television stations themselves. 3 of them, Mainichi, Nikkei, and Sankei, also own radio stations. Yomiuri owns a baseball team, Yomiuri Giants. All of them own a lot of magazines. All of them have, for decades, been very instrumental in cultural affairs, sponsoring and marketing major exhibitions of art and also music. Some of them have orchestras. Many of them have buttressed their financial strength through ownership of real estate, and many of them are also involved in book publishing. So these are large conglomerates. They're not specialized newspaper groups, and that concentration, together with cross-media ownership, has tended to make them very financially resilient compared with, at least in recent years, compared with many European and other groups. Second characteristic, though, is about politics. Politics in Japan is characterized by essentially being very unipolar. The LDP has governed Japan almost uninterrupted since 1955. That means there's less clear case for political partnership in the newspapers themselves or in the media groups, in the television stations, because the party contest is certainly not bipolar, but certainly not one leading to a great alternation of government. Yes, we can attribute different political characteristics to different Japanese newspapers, the Asahi more on the left, the Yomiuri and the Sankei more on the right, and so forth. But this is not really associated with direct political party affiliations in the way that it often is in European countries, and certainly, especially in recent years, in the United States. And that constance of one party in government, I think, is also the right background to the strength of the Keisha Club system. The Keisha Clubs, in which major organizations, particularly ministries, the government itself, the Cabinet Office, also major corporations, have essentially clubs of journalists who are dedicated to studying them, to reporting on them, and in which there is, in effect, a symbiotic relationship of information flow, one direction, in return for essentially not rocking the boat in the other direction. That would be unlikely to have survived if there'd been more alternation in government, at least at the national government level. It is, I think, a reflection of the political situation. Fourth characteristics is that thanks to that lack of political partisanship, and the nature of that media structure, investigations, scoops, revelations tend not to be done by the major newspapers. They tend to be done by independent weekly magazines, especially, but not only. Of course, they do exist in the newspapers, but essentially the newspapers see themselves and have behaved much more as advocacy channels advocacy of policy changes, campaigns about policy, rather than as tools of accountability. There is not a sense among the major newspapers of being what we in Europe would call the fourth estate, as being essentially a sort of constitutional check and balance in the way that is typically perceived in the United States or in Europe, rather that the newspapers, while of course being critical and being scrutineers, nevertheless, they're much more active in policy advocacy than they are in specific investigative work. And that advocacy, those role of those campaigns, have in a way given the newspaper groups with their television stations as very strong elements, as a kind of substitute in the Tokyo political world to a sort of think tank world that exists in Washington, London and Brussels, obviously less so in Dublin. But that they are, in a sense, the most active part of the policy community, alongside, of course, other research institutes and think tanks in Tokyo. But nevertheless, that is a large part of the role they play. And we will come later to the role that the social media have played in Japan in recent years. So you've got a different structure within which this technological change needs to be seen, and through which way this digital hurricane has blown in the Japanese context. I tend to think about the Japanese mass media that while they do have very special Japanese characteristics, we in Europe are probably a better place to understand them, simply because more of our European media environments are more similar to the Japanese one, particularly because of the strength of public broadcasting in Ireland, in the UK, and in a few European countries. The BBC and the NHK are essentially similar types of organizations, but also because of some elements of what I've been saying about the role taken by newspapers, perhaps particularly in Germany, which is a bit more similar to the Japanese one. So that's by way of framework. Let me talk briskly through what I see as the current story of mass media globally, then apply it again back to that Japanese mass media structure that I've described. The story of mass media is essentially the story of the greatest Dickensian cliche, which when I was editor of The Economist, I essentially banned because it could be used for almost as the intro of every story. In other words, the first lines of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. And this very much absolutely captures what the mass media revolution has consisted of, not just in the last 5 years in which fake news, what has been called truth decay, disinformation has become so prominent, but actually over a longer period with all that digital disruption. The former editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, wrote a book called Breaking News 2 years ago. It's called this a digital hurricane, leading to enormous job losses in media around the world, the closure of local newspapers, and a lot of anxiety about the status and future of the mass media. That explains why in Ireland there's been the Future of the Media Commission, why in Britain a favorite political game has been to put pressure on the BBC. That's the negative side, the worst of times. But let's look a bit, first of all, at the best of times. Why, in my view, this is actually an incredible time to be a journalist, and indeed an incredible time to be a consumer of all information resources. The internet, of course, has changed everything. The digital age has made the world, in effect, our oyster. 40 years ago, when I started work in the Brussels office of The Economist, I looked with awe at an enormous machine in the room next to my office, which I discovered was called a facsimile machine. I went down into the basement and found an ancient rusty machine, which I gathered was called a telex machine. These now almost museum piece means to send one's stories to head office were, if you like, the successor technologies of the time in the early 1980s. But really in those days, journalism was essentially done in the highly traditional way, using shoe leather, going to visit people, using the telephone, writing your stories on a typewriter. The real technological innovation at that time, at the beginning of my career, was satellite communications. And that made a difference not to journalists, but rather to the distribution and reach of media, particularly television, beginning in the 1970s and the 1980s, but also in the case of my employer, The Economist, satellite communications is what enabled The Economist for the first time in the late 1970s to start printing its weekly edition in the United States, in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, which was the beginning of its circulation growth in North America. It was in the tens of thousands at that stage. It's now 750,000 or 800,000 out of a total worldwide circulation of 1.3 million. So one can see that that technology suddenly opened up a new market. And if we fast forward to now, that technological revolution of the time is now applicable to all publications and all journalists. Access to information is extraordinarily easy at the touch of a key. Barriers to entry into the business are now low. We have essentially a borderless world in principle, bordered only by language. We have potential customers everywhere. In 1914, wrote John Maynard Keynes in his great post-war economic polemic, Economic Consequences of the Peace, globalization was then bringing, as he put it, opportunities, at least for the middle and upper classes, that were, quotes, beyond the compass of the richest and most powerful monarchs of other ages. And I'll read his phrase because I like it so much, his paragraph. He wrote that in 1914, before the First World War, the inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could at the same moment and by the same means adventure his wealth in the natural resources and new enterprises of any quarter of the world and share without exertion or even trouble in their prospective fruits and advantages. But most important of all, he regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it as aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. I think today, Keynes would be writing that about information, about the information age, and he would say, well, rather what I do every morning, that I sit in bed sipping in my case, my morning cappuccino, reading, listening, or viewing the information product of the whole world, tweeting or Facebooking to friends and followers all over the planet about news or articles. The sharing and access to information is indeed, as he might have put it, beyond the compass of the richest and most powerful monarchs or enlightened individuals of other ages. So that's the best of times. It is an extraordinary period that I can sit in bed looking at Nikkei Asia, looking at the Japan Times, looking at the Corriere della Sera, looking at the New York Times, looking at the Irish Times, looking at the Guardian, looking at the Financial Times, anything I really want to choose to look at instantly and absolutely up to date. What's the worst of times then? Well, the hurricane, of course, is the financial hurricane. Essentially, what's happened, of course, in the mass media is that thanks to the digital revolution, traditional media, past media, has lost all or part of its main revenue stream, namely advertising. Not to other publications or television, but largely to digital platforms and to publishers who now have direct access to customers via the internet rather than going through the mass media, which previously acted as the gatekeepers to those customers. In effect, in the past, news and information, and indeed the entertainment provided by television or by newspapers, was close to free of charge because advertising was subsidizing it. Newspapers cost almost nothing. Television, free-to-air television, is of course free, apart from your license fee for RTE or BBC or NHK. And we were getting essentially highly subsidized news, and essentially the source of that subsidy has been taken away. This has mainly hit print or providers of text-based publications by losing an enormous part of their revenue, but it's also eroded television. For television, the bigger factor is the proliferation of new competitors, new channels, including now subscription services like Netflix. But still, television has a pretty strong place as a medium for advertising, and therefore still has fairly robust revenue and business model. But that's certainly not the same for print publications, who are all having to look for new ways to make business. So that hurricane has transformed the business. It has fragmented mass media, no longer as mass as it used to be, by bringing in all sorts of new competition, multi-channel television, many more global publications, many more specialist publications, politically, functionally, or professionally, and geographically, because of the ability to target specific customers. Now, there's no need to shed tears in this context for particular media companies or for a particular past situation. They are just the losers, the dinosaurs, and there are plenty of new winners in this situation. But let's, for this purpose, and for the purpose of this discussion, focus on the consequences, not for the media as a business so much, but rather for the flow of information and for the workings of our politics, of our societies. I'd say there are basically three big consequences that I think we should be aware of, and that I will apply next to Japan. First is that what has been, or in the past was, a very concentrated, highly mediated flow of information, concentrated in a relatively small number of television networks, a relatively small number of national newspaper groups, a relatively small number of national magazine publishers, has now become much more diverse, much less clearly mediated by dominant anchor providers of information. Public broadcasters in our countries remain predominant, but as a declining share of attention, particularly among younger generations. So the way of receiving information has become much more diverse. It's now much less clearly curated by a relatively small number of groups. Second, the financial strength of media companies has now become much more variable and challenged. That matters obviously for an investor, but most of all, I think it has some impact on the political vulnerability of media companies. The essential route to independence for any media company is profitability. That enables you to resist pressure from commercial forces such as advertisers, but most of all to resist pressure from governments, from particular political parties. Say we're strong enough to sit it out until you're kicked out of office and replaced by somebody else. The increasing financial or the decreased financial strength of media groups has made them to some degree weaker and more vulnerable to that sort of manipulation or pressure, at least, by politics. And third, thanks especially to the rise of social media, political parties, political individuals, governments are better able than ever before to disintermediate, to find their own direct channels to the voter. In Italy in the 2000s, Silvio Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Italy, did that essentially through owning his own television channels and broadcasting his views through his television channels. Donald Trump did it through Twitter very clearly, and many other politicians try to do the same thing. So that's the change. You can see it in numbers. American newspaper total circulation, print and digital, in the year 2000 was 55 million weekday copies. By 2020, the number had halved, more than halved, or no, just about halved, to 24.3 million copies. Now, I'm going to jump forward to the Japanese picture, just to provide a direct comparison with that US newspaper circulation. The US number, 55 million in 2020, down to 24 million, sorry, 55 million in 2000, down to 24.3 million in 2020. In Japan, it is actually quite a similar story. In 2000, the combined newspaper circulation of all Japanese newspapers was an extraordinary 53.7 million. I say extraordinary because obviously it's a country around 1/3 of the size of the United States, or a bit more than 1/3. By 2020, the circulation had fallen to 35 million. So 53.7 down to 35 and gradually falling. So the same sort of trend of declining circulation among the media, the newspaper groups, has happened. And so too has the impact on revenue, which I'll come to in a second. I've got the numbers under here. We're in a new game in the mass media, commercially, which is a new game essentially of trying to get the reader or the viewer or the listener to pay directly rather than through advertising. And that's proving difficult. Some companies, such as the New York Times or the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, have done very well in converting to being essentially subscription models, subscription-based businesses, but many others have struggled. On the Reuters, the best source for this is the Reuters Institute of the Study of Journalism in Oxford, which produces an annual digital news report, which has asked a sample of readers around the world in an enormous number of countries around the world, how many of them have actually paid for news online in the past year. The country with the highest proportion of people who've paid is Norway at 28%. Japan, it's 10%. America, it's around 21%. So pretty low, but that is because the basic background has always been free media, through television especially. And now, obviously, they're strongly on the internet. The current outcome has been described by Reuters, I think, quite accurately, as not quite a winner-takes-all outcome, but rather a winner-takes-most outcome. In other words, that some large brands, large success stories in converting or creating trusted brands have been able to build subscription-based businesses and shrug off the loss of advertising that's basically been stolen, in effect, by the digital platforms and by specialist outlets. In that winner-takes-most environment, there have been some clear big signs of success in the sums paid by new buyers for publications. Just recently, the Axel Springer Group of Germany paid just over $1 billion for Politico. Politico, the American-founded provider of news and information in Washington and in Brussels and in some other places in Europe. Politico, the home publication, Politico Europe, the one that we tend to see over here. Axel Springer have just bought that for $1 billion, so it's obviously a pretty successful digital publication. In 2015, the Financial Times was sold by Pearson to the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, to Nikkei, for a similar sum, $1.3 billion, 845 million pounds. Again, because of its digital business and its potential as a digital business. Money, large sums of money have often changed hands. Jeff Bezos paid $250 million for the Washington Post in 2013. Rupert Murdoch paid a lot of money for the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones even earlier in 2007, $5 billion. So these are still valuable businesses, but the overall financial strength is now much more varied and much harder. We have essentially this digital disruption, a new shape for the fourth estate and vis-a-vis politics, great opportunities that people like Politico and the FT and Nikkei through the FT have managed to exploit, but very much difficult politics alongside, especially in social media. So let's apply this briskly to Japan. Very similar story. I've given you the newspaper circulation figures. Total revenue of newspapers over the last 20 years has essentially fallen by about half in Japan. Television has been affected much less so. So the cross-media ownership of the Japanese media companies clearly means that they have been more robust towards this digital hurricane, as Alan Rusbridger called it, and have been more able to share their resources across media. But nevertheless, there has been a general decline in income. In Japan, social media has behaved in a somewhat different way from in Europe and the United States. The most popular social media channel in Japan is in terms of frequency of use is YouTube. And YouTube with Facebook is only, I think, number 4 or 5 in the rankings. And so YouTube just shows that there is therefore some further competition to television for attention. Japanese media groups have typically been quite slow at adopting digitalization, largely because they haven't felt as imperative a financial pressure as has been felt in other markets. But that is now accelerating, and accelerated, of course, even more during the pandemic in the last 18 months. All Japanese newspapers have really started investing heavily in their digital editions. And if anyone wants a guide to it, I recommend the short but extremely informative summary on Japan within the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, which you can find on their website, written by Yasuomi Sawa, a journalist and professor at the Department of Journalism at Senshu University. He highlights especially, I think, 2 developments that are worthy of mention. One is that he has seen under this financial pressure, and perhaps as a result of trends in the global media, a trend of growing collaborations across Japanese media houses, including in investigative types of journalism. This has been encouraged to some degree by the impact of the Panama Papers investigation, and now the Pandora Papers that we've just seen. This habit of collaboration appears to have spread, but also I think newspapers have had a new interest in using it to shore up their circulations. He also mentions a new entrant to the subscription market this year, which sounds interesting, called Slow News, which specializes in long reads and tough investigations. combining local journalism with in-depth reports from international publications translated into Japanese, along with books, seeking to serve in a new way. So what we are seeing is a similar process of innovation and development, with, I think, digital publications having an increasingly important role. How has politics in Japan evolved alongside this? And Kurate Sensei mentioned the leadership election in the LDP that's just happened, choosing Fumio Kishida as the leader. Well, I think the first thing to mention about that is that only one of the 4 candidates for the LDP leadership was known to be active on social media, and that was Taro Kono, and he lost. So the role of social media in directly stimulating the way in which the LDP chooses its leaders is clearly not yet dominant. Kishida-san's main contribution on social media was to circulate a copy of the okonomiyaki pancakes, savory pancakes from Hiroshima that he ate as a celebration after being elected, rather than actually using it to promote himself. So I think the LDP is in a way an unchanging part of the scene, but I think an important background to the political relationship between the mass media and LDP has to be seen in the move from Prime Minister Abe to Suga and now to Kishida, in the sense that I think that during the 8 years of the Abe administration, we saw a new type of pressure on Japanese mass media, because a single faction, a single group from the LDP, a single leader with their staff was in office for such a long time. That enabled them, but also encouraged them to put much more pressure, especially on NHK, but also other broadcasters, to tone down or remove their critical coverage of politics. And I think also we saw alongside that a deployment of a relatively new trend of appointing outsiders as Director General of the NHK and trying to use those to manipulate or at least divert critical coverage. Close Up Gendai, which was one of the major political shows from the mid-1990s through until 2016, was brought to a close. Hiroko Kuniya, their very popular anchorwoman, was removed, forced to resign, allegedly for asking critical or at least aggressive questions of Prime Minister, of Cabinet Secretary Suga himself. So we saw, I think, in that Abe-Suga period, especially, quite an increased tension between the LDP and the media, and an increased willingness to intervene. And I think that may well continue given the general weakening of the media. But if the revolving door nature of LDP leadership reestablishes itself, as I think it's fairly likely to do with 1 or 2 year prime ministerships, we may find that we've seen the maximum period of political pressure on the mass media. More important politically is going to be the effect of that fragmentation and diversity of information flow within Japan. We have seen the use of television fall substantially by Japanese consumers, the use of internet obviously increasing just as everywhere else. And that has correlated also with a growth, pioneering growth in the 1990s of what can be called anti-social networks. 2-channel, Ni-chan, Yon-chan, and other private networks, which were essentially the precursors of the QAnon channel in the United States. And I think that decline in the role of mass media as like the chief social and informational framework for the society is perhaps the biggest conclusion that we have to draw from this digital hurricane that's hit, that there's now going to be a greater diversity of sources, therefore a greater diversity of networks, and that will gradually see its effect in politics. That fragmentation is likely to increase. Everyone is going to go digital, but also the barriers to entry are going to remain very low. So in sum, and to bring myself to an end, I think there are great opportunities, both for consumers of information and for the producers of it. But this is a more unruly, disordered information world, one in which efforts to regulate digital platforms and media and these antisocial networks are going to become among the top political and social issues of our time. But until or unless we find a solution to that, or governments find a solution to that, I think we're going to see in Japan as well the gradual political consequences of that loss of the simple, clear consensus pipeline of information that was there in the past. And I'll stop there and open to questions.
Thank you very much, Liu-san. And there are questions. I have a few questions. A very fascinating talk. But John has asked questions, 2 questions here. So let's start with those 2 questions, if you don't mind. So first question is, does Japanese demographics account for the slower decline in newspaper use than in US?
I think it clearly is part of it. That it clearly is perhaps a substantial part of it. I think also geography probably plays a part. That distribution challenges are not as great as they are in a large country like the United States. That makes a difference. And then I just think that this general, I know this is a supply side issue, but the greater financial resilience of the media groups means that they've been able to carry losses on subscriptions and keep the prices low and keep pushing them out. After all, they've had armies of sellers of these subscriptions. This is an incredibly large sales force that they all have had all around Japan, and that's been maintained for longer than would have been the case, if you like, with the Chicago Tribune or equivalent publications in the United States. So definitely demography will make a big difference to that, but I'd say it's not the only factor.
Okay, thank you. And the second question from John is, would stronger copyright infringement penalties help the newspaper industry? Is copyright protection stronger in Japan than in Europe or US?
I have to say I don't know the answer to that comparative question about copyright protection. As somebody from the newspaper industry, of course, I'm in favor of strong copyright infringement penalties. I'd love to protect my own copyright very well. I think that the biggest issue in newspaper revenues has been the ability of Facebook, Google, Yahoo, companies like that to essentially distribute free information. I think that's right. And so I think both legal and, if you like, negotiated stronger agreements to force fair use payments by those information aggregators would definitely help the traditional publishers, help the originator publishers, who are, after all, paying all the money to produce all that content, and just tilt the balance more away from those who are simply providing this as loss leader free information simply in order to get data to be able to sell against advertising. So yes, and that has been a trend of our time. There was a big case in Australia, and in fact resolved in the favor of the media groups and against Facebook, And I think that does need to be extended elsewhere. So that's where I would see it as being particularly pertinent.
Thank you very much. And I have a few questions myself. So I know you mentioned at the beginning that using culture is probably a kind of a substitute for what did you say? Basically curiosity and kind of scrutiny. But I wonder about the style of reporting in Japanese media in general. And you also mentioned referred to close-up Gendai and Kuniya-san. And I find there are fewer investigative sort of reporting and sort of reporting in Japanese media than in the UK or in other places. And do you find the same, or maybe it's somewhere else, but not in the main kind of a mainstream media platforms in Japan?
Well, I think that that certainly Japan is a less adversarial culture than some others. You know, there are others that are other countries that are also not very adversarial in their newspapers. And if one looks at, I look at Italian newspapers a lot. The basic cultural feature of an Italian newspaper article is that you have to get to paragraph 7 before you get to the point. In a way, that there's a cultural way of telling a story, and that it's not as punchy as in an English newspaper. So I don't deny that that culture plays a role. I think, though, that the biggest explanation for where investigative work goes, and also where the kind of views about accountability and the so-called fourth estate happen, is about the political structure. And you can call that culture if you like, but it's a reflection of politics rather than a reflection of society. So definitely, all of the great investigative scandal-based stories have been in like the Bunge Shunju or in other weekly magazines. Now the financial ones in papers like Facta. The Olympus scandal was broken by Facta with the whistleblower, for example. And there are, I think, investigative reporting has generally been put in special places, but it has definitely had a significant role. So yes, to come back, a much less adversarial, confrontational culture than some other countries. That's reflected in the style of newspaper writing.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean there's no investigation.
Yes, thank you. And also probably related to this, but you highlighted the continuity of the kind of relationship between politicians and the electorate in a way. I mean, the fact that Mr. Kono didn't win, although he's the most popular one on Twitter and so on. But in this era of globalization, you also highlighted a lot of changes that are happening globally. Do you see any globalization of the Japanese media, or still Japanese media is for Japanese people and it's kind of structured and constrained by the domestic social structures?
Well, I would say that there's clearly some globalization commercially, as evidenced by the Nikkei and its acquisition of the Financial Times and its development of Nikkei Asia as an English language publication, as an attempt to build a pan-Asian publication. But, and I'm limited by my language skills, my lack of language skills in reading it, but I think I'm right in saying that I think the degree to which the actual content, either on television or in newspapers, is, if you like, global, I'd say would not be evidence in favor of, if you like, the internationalization or globalization of the Japanese viewer or reader. In levels of interest in international stories, international issues have gone up and down over the sort of 30 or 40 years when I've been following this. But it certainly isn't a linear upward trend with globalization. I think it's tended to to have a lot of connection to the nature of the Japanese economy, the exposure of big Japanese companies or otherwise, and so forth. And I don't think that I would say that it was very globalized now. Now, through some of the satellite TV channels, there is more, perhaps, international news, international coverage, international features than there would have been 20 years ago. But I don't think that as a general rule that would be the case. Now, let's apply that to my country, Britain. It would also be true that in Britain, media has typically stayed remarkably parochial in some ways. So I don't think that that's exclusively to Japan. I think that we are nevertheless still in the sense that that not only all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill said in the US House of Representatives, but rather that all media is essentially local first and global only as an afterthought. And so I don't think that's something restricted to Japan.
Thank you. And I think, as you said, the Japanese language aspect probably plays a part in sort of projecting it as kind of very local. Whereas I think British newspapers, everything is probably about Britain, but still it has this kind of appeal and everybody reads about British politics because it's in English media.
Yeah, but in Britain we pay far too little attention to what's happening in the outside world, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I guess I know you have the second gig session later on today, Bill-san. So I will finish here. And thank you again for very stimulating talk. And